the cult of the Constitution from low to high energy democracy. And there are no readings this week, so we hope that there's a vigorous discussion and conversation. Next week we'll discuss John Dewey within the context of low to high energy democracy and the course. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Unger, who wants to fill in a few themes before we jump.
Yeah, the theme today for today's class is democracy and its future. But before we do that, I want to go back and address something that we slighted last time when we were discussing labor and capital. So let me first situate where we are in the argument. So we're now in the part of the course in which we're talking about the future, the project of American democracy, not just in politics, but in general. And there are three main axes which we are addressing. One is the transformation of the economy. And in the transformation of the economy, three problems, three areas. The relation of the vanguard, the most advanced sector, to the rest, the theme of the knowledge economy, exclusive or inclusive. Second, the relation of labor to capital. And third, the relation of finance to the real economy. In the current form of progressive politics, almost the entire range of concern is focused on the amelioration of inequality, compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer, and by redistributive social spending. We did speak to that early in the course, but that's not our main subject, or was not our main subject here. The second axis of this programmatic discussion is the transformation of politics, of democratic politics. That's our subject today. And the third is the transformation of consciousness and of education, which is our theme next week. Now, in addressing the relation of the vanguard to the rest and the future of the economy of the market order, one of the subjects was the relation of labor to capital. And I attempted there to distinguish the short term from the long term. In the short term, I propose to divide the discussion in two parts. One, the organized part of the labor market. And there, the main theme was the future of unionization. And the idea we discussed is that the traditional form of countervailing power, which is unionization, which was the main solution in the 20th century, is not a feasible solution in the 21st century. But if we are to attempt to revive countervailing power in the form of unionization, I argue that we should not revive it in the form that it used to take, which was collective bargaining, the contractual regime of labor. But we should revive it in a form which would be a hybrid of the two 20th century regimes of labor, collective bargaining on the one hand, and the corporatist regime on the other. Now, remember the main distinction between those two regimes. The contractualist regime is based on two principles. One is unionization is entirely voluntary, by analogy to freedom of contract. The workers choose to unionize or not. And the second is that the labor movement and the unions are entirely independent from the state. Thus, labor law is a part of private law. The contractualist regime, which originated in fascist Italy, but then spread through the agency of leftist, nationalist, populist governments in Latin America in the 20th century, is based on two other principles. The first is everyone is automatically unionized. And the second is The unions are a part of the state. They are parastatal organizations. The state orients them, guides them, and in the end controls them. They are a form of controlled popular mobilization, typically through the mediation of a Ministry of Labor. What I proposed in our argument last week, was that we should best adopt a hybrid regime, taking from collective bargaining the principle of complete independence of the unions from the state, but taking from the corporatist regime the principle of automatic unionization of everyone, according to their place in the production system. And that is to avoid the three characteristic defects of the collective bargaining system. The first is that the attempt to unionize and maintain the union is a labor of Sisyphus. It has to be restarted every day, whereas under the alternative corporatist system, the fact of unionization is a gift of the law. It's automatic. And therefore, the focus of labor militancy can go forward to the question not of maintaining the union or establishing the union, but of what to do with the union. The second is that in the collective bargaining system, the unions tend to express and reinforce the underlying inequalities of the production system. So there's a centrifugal force, a force of disintegration, because in the capital-intensive parts of the economy, the workers are in fact partners of the employers. The wage bill is a small portion of the cost of production, and the workers and their employers have common interests against everyone else. And the third defect of the pure contractualist system is that it has a purely economistic bias, a focus on wages and benefits, whereas under the corporatist equivalent, the focus can be a broader institutional concern with the institutional reformation of the market order. But the corporatist regime has a grave defect, which is the defect of the subjection of the unions to the tutelage of the state. So what would be the solution? The solution would be to take from the contractualist regime the principle of complete independence of the unions from the state, but to take from the corporatist regime the principle of automatic unionization. And I observed in last week's discussion that may be too late, because unionization has now withered to such a point that it may not be susceptible to being resurrected. And that's interesting methodologically, because it shows that in history, radically contingent as it is, there is no predetermined harmony between the ideas and the problems that they're designed to solve. The ideas may come too late. The politicians, including the progressive politicians, may say, we'll call the spirits, and the spirits may not come. And this is a dramatic instance of that problem. But there was a second issue with respect to labor and capital in the 21st century, and that's what you could call the emergency issue of the expansion of the precariat, the majority of workers who are to one extent or another in conditions of unstable employment, precarious employment. In the developing countries, that's often in the so-called informal economy, and in the rich countries of the North Atlantic world and their offshoots, it's in precarious, unstable employment. So you have a minority of workers, what the Marxists would call a labor aristocracy, in the vanguard of production, in the insular knowledge economy, and everyone else is not only consigned to some form of make work, but also reduced to a condition of precarious employment. That's what I'm calling the emergency problem. That's the problem that comes in first place. And what's then the solution to that problem? We did not adequately address that last week. And the solution seems to me to have two parts. We have to imagine a kind of sliding scale. We say, to the extent that these precarious workers can be organized and represented using the new technologies of information and communication, that should be our focus. But to the extent that they cannot be represented and organized, there should be direct legal intervention in the employment relation. With the following aim. The aim is to distinguish the legitimate and indispensable goal of flexibility in the labor market from the illegitimate and dangerous result of the mere cheapening of labor. So remember, when we started this discussion, I suggested that there are two discourses about labor in the world now. There's the neoliberal discourse, which under the euphemism of flexibility abandons the majority of the labor force to radical instability, insecurity. And there is the syndicalist discourse of the labor leaders of the labor movement, which wants to prohibit as a fraud on the law all forms of employment resulting from the new practices of production, as if one could, by decree, suppress these unstable labor relations. And I said, that too is unacceptable. So what we should desire is to have inevitable and necessary flexibility, but to prevent the transformation of flexibility into the cheapening of labor. Because the cheapening of labor is incompatible with an upward tilt to the returns to labor, which is required for there to be sustained growth in productivity. That is, there can only be an increase in the capital intensivity of production if we prevent labor from going down and becoming, in effect, a latter-day equivalent to slave labor. There's no sustained technological innovation, no sustained ascent in productivity in a slave economy. Now, how are we to do that then? We're to do that first by attempting to prioritize the organization and representation of these unstable workers. But then second, to the extent that we can't achieve that result, to mandate a limitation on the cheapening of labor by, for example, instituting a principle of price neutrality, that labor rendered under conditions of unstable employment must be remunerated in terms comparable to the remuneration of similar labor performed under conditions of stable employment, thus distinguishing legitimate support for the remuneration of labor from illegitimate constraint on the flexibility of labor. Now, there's a third area which is important, and maybe the most important of all, which is the influence of the state on the evolution of technology. The premise is that technology has no intrinsic logic of evolution. Technology evolves in a way which is indeterminate. We determine the direction that it takes. And we should have as our objective 3 goals. The first goal is that we want the most advanced technologies the technologies of the labor economy to evolve in ways that are accessible to the majority of the labor force. Right. So that means to the small and medium-sized firms of the backward economy, but also to the multitude of individual economic agents who have no stable connection to any business organization. So it's not just small and medium-sized backward businesses. It's also these individual agents, like the nurse practitioner or the machine repair person. The second goal is that we want technology, the most advanced technologies, to evolve in a way which empowers labor rather than just replacing it. Now, all technology, to some extent, will replace labor, some forms of labor. The question is whether, in addition to replacing labor, it also empowers labor. And the third goal has to do with the more distant future. It's to say, the ultimate objective should not be to form a machine which is a proxy for the human mind, like the concept of artificial general intelligence. The ultimate objective should be to form a machine that, precisely because it is radically different from the human mind, it has powers that the human mind lacks, computational powers, is able to interact with the human mind and empower it. So that was the argument that we missed, and this is a problem of vast consequence. Now, looking to the way to the future, of course, there's another problem which emerges, and that is the future of the higher forms of free labor. So remember, it was only at the end of the 19th century that wage labor began to be naturalized as the natural form of free labor. Right. Up to that point, the general view is that wage labor is a deficient and transitory form of free labor, right, and the higher forms of free labor are self-employment and cooperation. That was what you read, for example, in Abraham Lincoln's address to the Wisconsin Agricultural Society in 1859. Right. And that was the general belief in the 19th century of liberals as well as socialists.
That's right. Especially in, that was not so much the case in large cities with that spawned industrialization with the war, but in most parts of the country that was correct. Yeah.
And this was the belief. It was, for example, the belief of the major liberal theoreticians and philosophers like John Stuart Mill. Yes. John Stuart Mill invented the jurisprudence, the legal doctrine of the joint stock corporation, as a result of as part of his intention to empower workers, so that they could compete with the capitalists.
And Mill isn't read. I think Mill should be required reading, but in the 19th century, Mill was a major figure, especially in the United States, not just England, not just Europe, but essentially anyone who was ambitious. I mean, so for example, Lincoln, who got no formal education, made a point to read deeply Mill. Yes. And that's just representative. And that was representative. I mean, I can give you all kinds.
So the hardening of the lines between liberals and leftists is a 20th century phenomenon. Absolutely. It was not a 19th century phenomenon.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
And so the 19th century had in abundance what we might today describe as left liberals.
Yes. Yeah. And left liberals, there was a broad range, and the left liberals, their vision of liberalism evolved based on what was happening in the society, in the country.
Yes.
So someone, the Civil War is the best example. I mean, Lincoln was very much he was a liberal, but was not an abolitionist. He never defined himself as an abolitionist, which is a radical. And when, following his election, the day after he's elected, South Carolina secedes, which starts the seceding process, and Lincoln and everyone else in the North recognize this is committing treason. You cannot do. There's a long precedent for that, and Lincoln suddenly becomes more progressive,
Yes.
based on circumstances that are happening in the nation. But he never ever referred to himself as a revolutionary or as a radical.
Well, and so remember when we were discussing finance, finance and the real economy, and I said the long-term solution is the radical one, right?
Yes.
And then which I proposed the thought experiment of vesting the major means of production in liquid capital and funds,
Right.
which are not instruments of the state. The state sets up the legal framework for these funds under different regimes of time, different time horizons, different tolerances of risk and so forth. But the funds conduct a rotating auction of capital. So whoever can use the capital most efficiently prevails at the auction and gets temporary use of the funds. And that was the regime that I described as capitalism without capitalists. Now, under such a system, now, there's a different future for this mass of small-scale economic agents, whether businesses or individuals, because they have the possibility then of auctioning away some of this liquid capital and using it.
Right.
And that's the solution to the problem that was left unsolved in the 19th century.
Right.
The problem that was left unsolved was that there was no apparent way of reconciling small scale of production, small scale producers and small scale production with the aggregation of resources at scale.
That's right.
And the only way in which you can have radical economic decentralization coinciding with resources at scale, big business,
Right.
is by innovations in the property regime. Because otherwise, it depends on there being rich people and poor people.
That's right.
Rich people who are titans of finance, who control vast funds, like who own hedge funds,
That's right.
or who are bankers or leaders of banks and so forth. So that's the connection in which that would be the most radical advance in the organization of the market economy.
Yes.
And it's for failure to be able to solve that problem that the examples in the 19th century of these artisan economies, like the economy of the United States in the North, were unable to maintain themselves in the period of economic concentration.
Right. I think they could have, but
But only by radical restraints on economic
that's
growth.
right. But what also happened is, in the Gilded Age, the United States became a very aggressive imperialist nation. And the imperialism taking over, whether it's Hawaii or I mean, a huge countries and nations, they did so because the new industrialists overproduced. And there weren't enough people in the United States who were able to buy them. And so they faced the dilemma of going bankrupt or convincing politicians to expand the United States so that they could provide, they would become recipients of these industrialists. And had that not happened, large corporations would have gone bankrupt, and there would have been a continuation and perhaps an expansion of some sort of artisanal system, because it does exist it continues to exist in a lot of places in the North where railroads did not exploit them, but there was a profound transformation.
And this is a very interesting problem, once again, methodologically in thinking about history, because what I'm claiming at this step in the argument is that the absence of an idea
Yes.
had decisive consequences.
Yeah, that's right.
And furthermore, that no one, I'm literally making this claim, no one in the 19th century had this idea.
No, right, that's correct.
And because it depended on some prior intellectual work.
Right.
And the prior intellectual work was the disaggregation of the idea of property, which was the main intellectual enterprise of the jurists from the middle of the 19th century to the end of the 20th century. There's the demonstration that the market order has no single natural and necessary form.
Right.
What is it based on? It's based on this idea that property is a bundle of powers and that these properties can be unbundled and shaped in all sorts of different ways.
Right.
That became the basis for the legal organization of the financial markets, which are markets and derivatives of the property right. But the generalization of that idea into an idea that you can organize markets in all sorts of different ways only came at the end of this process. So once again, there's a historical problem,
Right.
but the idea for it doesn't appear when it should appear.
Yes,
Huh?
that's right. That's right.
There isn't this harmony
That's right.
between the history of ideas and the history of practical problems in society.
That's right.
And this is a very dramatic expression of that disharmony. Now that's what I wanted to say by way of what I skipped over. And it is a
That's
very
great.
momentous problem for
Yeah.
the society, which we can hardly do justice to
Right.
in the few minutes that we've devoted to it. Would someone like to make a remark?
I mean, in one sense, it remains a dilemma today. It remains a dilemma today.
It's not really a dilemma, right, John? I mean, it's a problem.
Problem.
because and
I soft-coded.
and I once again I repeat what was said in earlier classes, which is that there's a curiosity in this, which in a way this thought experiment of the funds of the rotating capital auction is simply an enactment of orthodox finance theory, because orthodox finance theory says that's what already happens.
Right, right.
The existing capital market, so long as it doesn't suffer from some failure of competition or some form of asymmetrical information, auctions off resources to their more efficient users. And that, they say, is what already happens. So, and that argument was used, for example, when people protested against the so-called spontaneous privatization in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they say, that allowed some of the so-called oligarchs to acquire resources of the Soviet state for a song. And people protested, you're letting
That's right.
these thieves get away with murder.
Yes. They did get away
And
with
the answer
murder.
was, it doesn't matter.
That's right.
Because in the long run, it's going to end up in the hands of the most efficient users anyway. So the thought experiment is simply testing this proposition. Put up or shut up, show that this is the way it is. Yes?
I like your analogy to the trust system being like orthodox finance theory.
Yeah.
When I was listening to you, it sounded like you were trying to smuggle back in Marxism and the idea of five-year plans and central planning into the market and call it decentralization. And one of the things I was,
But there's no planning here.
you have to have people.
I mean, no, wait a minute, because what is defined is the regime of decentralization. But there always has to be a definition of the regime of decentralization, because there's no natural or automatic way of decentralizing access to economic resources. But I think it would be an abuse of terminology to call that planning Why is that planning? That's like saying under the current American regime of a certain kind of property right, that's planning in the same sense of what we're calling planning here. I mean, that's the problem in all these debates about the alternatives of the market economy. If I discuss, and I said this also in an earlier class, if I'm debating with Larry Summers a way of reconstructing the market economy, and I present a proposal like this one, he says, well, that's statism.
That's right.
Because
That's
he
right.
thinks that
That's
the
right.
market as established is the natural market.
Yes.
Uh, And any alternative form of the market is not natural, and therefore statist.
That's right. He's out and actually he's used that term too.
Your argument is that the current model of the market is based on our conception of property. And I don't think that property, even if I agree with you that it was a social construct and created, was designed to create the system of the market that we have today. I think that especially the financial system that evolved on top of modern property rights wasn't intended from the top down. That was a modern
Yeah, no, because the actual financial system is the result of a combination of the orthodox theory of property that came from the 19th century,
Yeah.
before the disaggregation of property, and the analytic and practical fruits of the partial disaggregation of property. Because being able to have a market in derivatives of the unified property right, which is what the financial markets are, is already the result of this disaggregation.
You can't dispossess people of their property in the market for derivatives. In the model that you're suggesting, you are saying that the central planners would be able to, after a period of time.
No, don't call this the central planners. I protest. They're not the central planners.
And also the United States did dispossess people of their property with the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. They dispensed with property, which had been a central theme, and actually there was effectively a market in slave trading. So you could track the average value or price of an enslaved person, male or woman, and it basically went nothing but up from 1830s.
No, for example, I'll tell you one way in which there are many pathways to this result. Because since it's just a thought experiment, we don't have to discuss the actual path of transformation. But one path to the result is just the radicalization of the taxation of inheritance,
Yeah, that's
which is a familiar part of the existing economy. Right. So how does the money, the liquid capital that would be in these funds get there? It says it gets there because rich people die. And instead of having their money go to their children, you take their money when they die and you put it in the rotating capital auction. Huh? Yeah.
I would distinguish between human property and, for instance, if a bank gives you a loan to start a company and it ends up being very successful.
No, but corporations.
Would you equate that to owning a person? I would say
Yeah.
it's a moral reason to dispossess.
No, corporations don't die, but the tax lawyers are smart enough to figure out if a rich person dies and part of his assets are stock in a corporation, they'll tax that stock. It's the same thing.
And
The core of my question is this. In the model you're describing, even if we don't call it central planning, even if it's an independent trust that's subject to legal rules and it's not the state, and it's this nice new conception that we like, it has no relationship to our system, when does the capital that's temporarily let down, when does it get to be recalled? Because if you take the capital.
That's what I think has to be a wide range of regimes that we experiment with. That is, would be part of the task of the democratic institutions that set up such a system under the law to say, we'll have different regimes, there'll be different time regimes, different degrees of risk tolerance, different ways in which the different conditions under which the resources are bid initially, and different regimes under which they're bid back. And rather than having one system which makes it seem that there's a perpetual motion machine, an automatic thing, you experiment with a wide variety and you see what works. You say this worked better, that worked worse. We've tried this out for 20 years and this other system works better. There's no way in which we could a priori and dogmatically know beforehand what would be the best without trying it out. But that's part of this objection to the way of thinking of the Americans about these economic institutions. They say, we'll experiment with everything, we won't be dogmatic, we won't be like those bad Europeans who have all these a prioris, but why don't they do that with their arrangements? So I say radicalize it. I don't want a domesticated pragmatism. I want a radicalized pragmatism that's pragmatic about the frameworks and not just pragmatic about what goes on within them. Well, shall we go on to the topic of democracy? Okay, so let me begin with, because there's a polemical contrast in these ideas between a high-energy democracy and the low-energy democracies which I say exist.
Right.
And let me now define how I understand the high-energy democracy and how it differs from the existing low-energy democracies. So there are three main dimensions of difference, of distinction. So the first relates to the coexistence of democracy with the class system. So all the existing democracies in the world exist in class societies. Class societies are societies in which the life chances of individuals are mediated through the differential distribution of advantage and opportunity, economic and educational advantage and opportunity through the family. And that results in these class structures. And as we argued toward the beginning of the course, there's a recognizable and very familiar class structure in the United States. The Americans think their country is classless, but it's not classless. And in fact, it being class-ridden, one of the bases of its class character is the denial of class.
That's right, that's right.
So the illusion of its real character is part of what allows it to remain the way it is. So there's a plutocratic elite at the top. Then there's this professional business class. Then there's a small business class. And there's a working class divided into white collar and blue collar segment. And then there's a racially stigmatized underclass. It's an entirely familiar form.
Which didn't exist in much of the 19th century.
Yeah. And the Americans think that the predominant part of the American population is something called the middle class, which I say doesn't exist because it's a middle class is a worker with a bourgeois identity, right? It doesn't really exist. So how can democracy coexist with a class system? Democracy is by its very nature the negation of a class system. And one of the ways in which a weak democracy is weak is that it doesn't create trouble for the class system. And instead of creating trouble for the class system and subverting the class system, the opposite happens, which is the class system invades the democracy. It captures the democracy in a whole range of ways. And you could call the ability of the democratic state to resist capture, you could call that provocatively the hardness of the state, right? The state resisting capital. Now, under this, because all the democracies in the world are weak democracies, existing in class societies, one of the ways of attempting to circumvent this situation is by allowing the state to be in the hands of a collective dictatorship, like the dictatorship of the Communist Party in China. which claims to be a vanguard of the people,
That's right.
speaking for the national interest, for the popular interest, and therefore able to close the gates of the democratic state and prevent its capture. But we know what happens. What happens is that the dictatorship then becomes hostage to the interest of this dictatorial authoritarian vanguard to retain its power no matter what, and then political power is converted into economic power, and economic power is converted back into political power. So the dictatorial alternative is not really an alternative,
Right.
but simply a worsened continuation of the situation under weak democracy. Because in weak democracy, at least there's the possibility of making trouble of some kind through the appropriation of politics for the purpose of subversion of the class system.
That's right.
So the first sense of a high-energy democracy is a high-energy democracy is a democracy that creates trouble for the class system persistently, permanently, radically. And of course, in the history of political thought, this was a familiar problem. In the 19th century, the universal belief of both the leftists and the liberals was that none of the elitist democracies of that day could establish universal suffrage, because they thought as soon as universal suffrage was established, the workers would destroy the capitalists. And there would be revolution, there would be a violent breakdown of the social order. And so they had to test the step-by-step expansion of the suffrage, like testing the water, like going into the pool. They feel it's cold, but then you get used to it. And then they discovered, to their astonishment, because this was a big surprise in the 19th century, that everyone could be given the vote, and basically nothing would happen.
That's right. That's right.
And this was, and this was a huge surprise in the 19th century. Sometimes not only would it happen, but the workers would vote for alternatives in the interest of the rich people.
Yes. And in most countries, voting was a holiday. It was to make sure that everyone was able to vote.
Of course, and that's true in most societies
Most
today.
societies, yeah. The U.S. is unusual
Yeah.
in not having voting a holiday.
So that's the first sense. And so how does a democracy make trouble for the class system? It makes trouble through structural reforms. And structural reform is not like revolution imagined by Marxism. Structural reform is typically fragmentary, but it can nevertheless be radical in its outcome if it persists in a certain direction. And then we can ask, in the conception of a high-energy democracy, exactly which structure of the state would be most likely to accentuate the decisive contradiction between democracy and class and subvert class. Under the present system, class subverts democracy, and under the alternative, democracy would subvert class. How would the state arise? They could do that. So that's the first criterion. Yes.
I'm curious, as we talk about this, if you could please elaborate a little bit on, in the contemporary American context, how or if you distinguish between wealth and class, and if you think there is, even currently, a really important distinction between
Wealth
those.
and class?
Yeah, or if you see them as now as primarily
Well, I
overlapped.
think because the concept of class, as discussed by the sociologists, is not supposed to be just a continuum of income and wealth, right? It's because the different classes have different forms of life, different forms of consciousness. So unlike just this idea of a continuum, a gradation, a continuous gradation of wealth and income, there are two things. The first is that it's discontinuous. There are certain breaks which are not accounted for by this idea of the continuum. And the second distinction is that the economic differences are associated with differences of consciousness and differences of forms of life, of social habits. That makes class something different from a mere continuous gradation of wealth and income. And it's, in the United States, that's true. And you don't account for class differences simply by describing differentials of income and wealth. That's only part of the story.
I guess sort of categorize sort of the current, top wealthiest sort of group in the U.S., like the current tech executives in that group, which are in a sense new money more so, as part of what you described as the plutocratic elite, or as the upper sort of business management.
Yeah. So what's the question?
Well, just so I'm understanding how you're thinking about this, where would you were talking before about the different classes in the U.S., the plutocratic elite, and then the sort of the upper business class. And I'm curious where you would place some of the wealthiest individuals in the U.S. who are often newer
Well,
money.
they're successful adventurers. I don't think they're representative of the class system. At the top, there's a professional and business class. There's an upper crust, which now has accumulated vast amounts of liquid capital because they're successful adventurers, right? But they're not representative of a larger collective social phenomenon.
That's right. And the United States has been unusual in the blurring of the class structure. The vast majority of Americans, and it's changed a bit over the past 15, 20 years, but throughout the 20th century until 15, 20 years ago, the vast majority of Americans define themselves as middle class. And that included multimillionaires, and it included workers who were struggling but able to support a family. But middle class, the range was huge.
So, and this is modified by the American tolerance for radical wage differentiation. So the difference between the remuneration of the CEO and the remuneration of the worker in the United States is a multiple of what the difference is in Japan or in Germany. So these are differences even in the advanced societies. And it's a unique characteristic of the United States. The United States is the only country in the world that tolerates this degree of disparity. Paradoxically, it's the one that's most inclined to deny the reality of class.
That's right. Yes, exactly right. That's right.
So now a second criterion for distinguishing low and high energy democracy is that a high energy democracy is a democracy that diminishes the influence of the past over the future, a high energy democracy. Path dependency. So path dependency, the influence of the path on the future, is not a constant. It's a variable, according to this idea. And it depends, the strength of path democracy depends on the nature of institutions and on the ability, on whether institutions are organized in such a way that they facilitate their own revision. So a social structure, unlike a natural structure or a natural phenomenon, doesn't either exist or not exist. Its existence does not have a univocal sense. It exists to the extent that it's entrenched, that it entrenches itself against challenge and change. And so you could say that a structure exists more or less. A democracy, a society can be organized in a way which makes all of its arrangements easier or harder to change. And the structures of politics have a special place in this, because on the one hand, they influence the terms under which everything else is changed or not changed. But on the other hand, they are particular structures which are themselves susceptible in a higher or lesser degree to change. So, and this is a unique character of democracy. Now, and it leads to a certain confusion in debates about change and change of politics around the world. Because the reformers around the world typically think the reform of politics has to come first, because the reform of politics is the mother of all reforms. It's the reform that controls all other reforms, right? But that's not how things happen.
That's right.
Because no country reforms its state or its politics in order later to decide what to do with the reformed politics or state.
That's right.
In reality, the reformation of politics only happens in the middle of a struggle over the social and economic direction.
That's right.
So then in this precedence is transformed.
Right.
And so you could say a high energy democracy is a democracy that weakens the power of the past over the future.
Right.
And overthrows the rule of the living by the dead, which exists also in democracy. We discussed this early in the course. Thomas Jefferson, one of the revered founders, proposed that the American Constitution should be trashed every 2.5 generations.
That's right.
Because according to his arithmetical calculus, that was the mark that would determine whether the majority of people living at a certain time were living when the Constitution was adopted and formulated. And he didn't want the people to live under a regime which had been authored by the dead.
That's right.
Which is a literal expression of this problem. So the societies of the world, or the democracies, are like planets in their orbits. And the question is, what knocks them out of their orbits? Or to what extent can they be knocked out of their orbits? And that's one of the criterion for differentiating a high energy democracy from a low energy one. Yes.
Building off one of the key themes in the class is like, how can we achieve this political, social, economic change without having a disorienting, event like a war or an economic collapse that brings change about. So how do you think a politician could, instead of having an answer, run on the basis of, I'm going to be someone that experiments. We are going to try new things. We're going to throw things to the wall and see what sticks. How do you think voters would react to that when people want certainty? I feel like people would not vote for uncertainty or someone that is going to...
Well, first of all, you're speaking as if this was a fabulous thing which couldn't happen. But you're describing Franklin Roosevelt and the very words he used at the start of his 4 terms. He said, the solution is experiment again, try everything.
That's right.
If one thing doesn't work, try another thing. That's what he said. Now, it's true that that was tolerated then because it was in the middle of a crisis. Right. And that's the third criterion that I want to come to next. So I'm going to speak to that. But I think that we can present this problem in a more abstract form. So remember the distinction that I drew between the ordinary moves that we make within a framework of arrangements and assumptions that we accept. And then there are the extraordinary moves by which from time to time we challenge and change parts of the framework, typically under the provocation of a crisis. Right. Either a social crisis or an existential crisis of the individual. So one of the ways of thinking about freedom, what freedom is to be freer and greater and more powerful. We have to narrow the distance between these two sets of moves. so that it's not as if we're in a prison of the habitual or inherited arrangements, and then suddenly we escape from it when there's some terrible crisis. We should be able to challenge and change pieces of the framework little by little. And the business of changing them should grow organically out of the ordinary business of life and shouldn't be seen as some suspension that only occurs in moments of revolutionary fervor.
Right.
So in other words, we begin to render transformation banal, thinking that it happens all the time in little bits and pieces. And then it begins also to lose its terror. We don't associate it with some terroristic moment of sudden upheaval. But we think that's what stability consists of.
That's right.
So you could say that that's one of the standards for judging the advance and the maturity of a society or a culture or a political culture, that it splits the difference between anarchy and order, and that it is an ordered anarchy. That's what the market is supposed to be. So that's also a way of thinking about democracy. Yes.
To follow up on that, to go from the abstract back to the practical then, basically what we have to unassume then is that the people who are in power at the moment when we're trying to make those tiny shifts are willing to relent the power that they have. And so I find that to be like a crux of difficulty, because it's very hard. People generally do not want to give up power, even if they have tiny pieces of it.
Of course.
So how do you do that? Because I feel like
Well,
that's
what do
the
you mean?
problem.
That's a question of institutional design as well as change of consciousness.
But even our institutions-
Take, for example, the distribution of magistrates in the Roman Republic. Forget about now, right? So the Romans were very interested in this problem. They were very worldly, they're very practical, and very successful. So one of the things they did is they doubled all their magistrates. So there were 2 consuls, there were 2 praetors, there were 2 tribunes. Everything happened both. And the second one could block what the first one did. The tribunes representing the populace could block what any magistrate did. And the dictators could be dictators for only 6 months. Imagine that. If Donald Trump, for example, could be in power for only 6 months. But this was part of their statecraft.
But isn't that already reflected in the American system, in the sense that we have the United States House of Representatives and we also have the Senate as one example, but then within that we also have political parties that essentially are supposed to be representing what you're saying?
Yes, but we're going to come to that. So the American institutional imagination and constitutional imagination has this liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, and then it has a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. So if there's an impasse, perpetuate the impasse. And the perpetuation of the impasse is regarded by this conservative constitutional imagination as a solution and not the problem. Unlike the Romans, who said if there's an impasse, let the impasse arise and then resolve it quickly. In other words, accelerating politics. So none of this stuff is automatic. It depends on how you organize things.
May I make one more comment about
Yes.
that? So isn't that impasse a result of power? Like it's stubborn power. Because what else? I'm trying to see clearly, like what else would be in the way other than power? And power obviously has many forms, but if I just like root it to the reality of today, we have like, excuse me, but we have like dinosaurs basically in our legislature that never want to leave. Some of them are voting in the morning and dying in the afternoon, quite literally. And it makes it very difficult when people see, hey, that person no longer is actually able to like do that job. But there's a reticence to call that out, and so then we have people in the system that are protected by. It's like the ordinary and extraordinary.
But I don't understand the question you're asking.
The question is the power that exists. I don't have an imagination about how to get around the impasse, because having been inside of it, it is, even as a very like subversive person, which I was, it is so challenging to even get socialists to want to get on board. And I'm not even an identified socialist to get on board with what you're saying. That's
Well,
the
I was
practical.
saying no one likes to lose power once they have it, but we're not discussing that at the moment, right? We're discussing how to change the terms under which the power is organized.
But who changes the terms? People with power.
Yeah, but I mean, the way you're talking about it is nothing could ever change in the world, right?
I mean, really,
So there
very
are
little
constitutional
changes in the United
conventions,
States.
there are redrafting of arrangements. It starts somewhere. It always starts somewhere. There's always the question of what next, how to redesign the system. The particular problem that you are invoking is that people take a long time to die. They hang around, and so on. But there are solutions to that. But there are solutions to that.
But the solutions, especially in democracy, tend to take longer. They tend to take longer. And the great politicians recognize comparatively rare moments in which there's almost what I would call revolutionary sensibility that offers an opportunity to implement dramatic change quickly.
Yeah.
So
That depends on crisis. as you
Exactly.
Suggested, and we'll come to that next.
And that's
the
exactly, I mean,
third
so
criteria.
FDR is a great example, and Professor Unger's example of FDR, I mean, FDR literally said, I'm just throwing clay on the wall to see what sticks. But because he understood that this is an extraordinary opportunity, he doesn't have a lot of time, so he's just throwing stuff on the wall to see what's going to work.
But of course, the reality is that the way you described it just now, it sounds like he was trying everything. But he wasn't trying
he wasn't
everything.
trying it, but he was trying a few
he was selecting from a small menu of corporatist arrangements.
That's true. That
because
is true.
those were the ideas
That's right.
available in the world in the 1930s. He was pretending to be a radical experimentalist, but he was just one more person at the mercy of the available ideas.
No, that's
Yes.
Thanks. So I have a thought and question about high energy democracy at a very local level. But first, I did want to just full disclosure, I do have my service dog with me today. It's not always medically necessary for her to be with me, but it is today. Just wanted to forestall any distraction. She's hypoallergenic. Anyway, sorry. But anyway, so high energy democracy at the very, very local level. So I'm from Louisiana. I was talking with an activist friend recently who's from Grand Isle, which is the very, very, very tip of the boot. I mean, literally at this point, it is in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm sorry, I refuse. It is the Gulf of Mexico. And anyway, for those of us who are from the Gulf, all right, I'll stop. Anyway, so it is an island now. It didn't used to be. There is a community there who is now even more pronouncedly isolated, but they have been activated. They are a very energetic community, and they are working together to make small bits of progress with how they think about the changes that they're facing in their community. Brain drain, people leaving, erosion. Obviously, they're getting more and more isolated from the mainland. I mean, there's issues with even like medical care because of infrastructure. Anyway, what I'm asking here is that for a community that is so dedicated to high energy democracy, that is actively reaching out to other communities in the area and making progress, what do you do when there are insurmountable obstacles? Like, what do you do when their land is literally eroding into the water? And what do you do when high energy democracy, which is forward thinking and based on the future, what do you do when you really can't escape aspects of past generations that now have irreparably damaged the community? And I know that you might say, and this is something I'm gonna write on, so I know this is a broader conversation that I'm looking into, but I know an option is for them to leave, but they won't. They can't, they're connected to the community, and if we really want high energy democracy, they should be able to build that where they are. It should be based on their connection with community and the land. So anyway, what do you do when there are insurmountable obstacles that, and of course we could take this to the broader level with climate change, but I'll leave it at this concrete example.
Well, what are insurmountable obstacles? I don't understand
The
that.
fact that their land is disappearing into the Gulf of Mexico.
Every practical problem has a practical solution. It can be easier or harder to come by.
Right, and I guess
That's another thing, right, is that there are definitely people looking into ways to rebuild the land. Quite
Right.
literally. I mean, it's been done before. I mean,
Right,
Venice and
right.
Amsterdam.
Yes, yes.
but there is
Many
not
times in history.
the what yes, but there's not enough of an economic interest in doing it, and the problem is that it is a short-term issue, not a long-term issue. Their forecast is they probably
Sure.
realistically have 20 years.
Yeah, but that only illustrates that there's always a practical solution. It's just harder or easier, right? I mean, climate change, the main danger facing humanity is war among the great powers. It's not climate change. Climate change is a practical. Up to now, in the evolution of our species, there's never been a practical problem which we have been unable to solve. The problems that we can't solve are problems that arise from our animosity to one another, from our rivalries, from our passions.
One more thing on that. No, and I think from an optimistic and point of view, and really from a necessary point of view, right, for high energy democracy, we have to believe that we can surmount any obstacle. And I guess that becomes my question. Do we let tiny communities, tiny pockets of high energy democracy, do we accept that it won't always work in very, very limited cases? Do we just accept that maybe the Louisiana case study will need to encompass multiple small communities? Do we, like, is that maybe the solution if economically it is not feasible to save Grand Isle? Is it that we then just look at?
I think one of the innovations necessary to the contemporary democracies is to find a way of organizing interventions that are structural but localized. Because our idea of structural change is that it occurs only through universal rules, and so you either adapt them or not adapt them. But that's incompatible with the nature of experimentalism, because experimentalism has to allow for the combination of the structural with the localized. And I do want to speak to that. So now the second criterion of a high energy democracy is it diminishes the force of path dependency, the power of the past over the future. The third criterion is it weakens the dependence of change on crisis, the theme that you introduced. So change is always going to be promoted by crisis. But the question is, to what extent is crisis the inevitable enabling circumstance of change? And a criterion of a high energy democracy is that it needs trauma less to make transformation possible. That's another criterion. So it's not like the situation of there has to be a war, there has to be an economic collapse, otherwise nothing will change. Roosevelt, we were talking about a minute ago, had the greatest war in human history and the greatest economic collapse ever as his allies. And even then he had trouble.
Yes, that's right.
Because it was the system was organized to give him trouble. So and of course, then there's a circularity, because if we say we want innovations that will diminish the dependence of change on crisis, but those innovations may themselves depend on crisis, right? So how do we break this circularity? One of the ways that we break the circularity is the imagination. And the imagination speaking in the voice of the political prophet. The task of the imagination is to do the work of crisis without crisis. It's like the idea of having a war economy without a war.
That's right.
Huh?
That's right.
So that, yes.
Do you believe that there is
I don't think that there's a fatal contradiction between increasing the temperature of politics, which is the level of political engagement, popular political engagement, and maintaining the vitality of the democratic institutions, the ability to substitute power. We'll come to this when we discuss the institutional design. I don't believe, now I think there is a tension, but I don't think that there's a simple trade-off of the kind that more energy is more danger to freedoms. So, and this comes up in every domain. For example, we were talking before about the market order. And remember, I said we would always want to have, as one of the forms of decentralization of property, the absolute property right of the 19th century, because it has a priceless advantage, which it allows someone, the owner, to do at his own expense and at his own risk something that no one else believes in. So I want there to be in the economic system a way of organizing the decentralized distribution of capital that allows someone to take a risk in which no one else will support him in the whole world, and to do it on his own. If he can convince other people to support him, so much the better. And that same logic would apply in many domains. But I don't think it's a universal trade-off in which more energy is less guarantee of individual freedom. Yes.
I wanted to comment on that, and to agree with what you're saying. And I think this is an important point to make, right? I mean, we've talked about Emerson, and we've talked about the idea of individual liberty and like what that means. And in this case, I agree. I think high energy democracy, if anything, would allow people to really not only recognize the individual liberty that they have, but to be inspired by others who are exercising the rights that they have, the freedoms that they have. And like you say, with private property, I mean, with a high energy democracy, with more just ideas and energy circulating, people can take advantage of their own power and their own entrepreneurial spirit to actually, make a difference in their own lives. And so I think that, separately from even talking about this.
And going back to the economic example, so in the discussion of the market order, the basic idea is not the idea that there should be a capital auction instead of private property. That's just a secondary idea. The basic idea is that the market order should not be pinned to a single dogmatic version of itself. There shouldn't be a single form of economic decentralization. There should be multiple forms. And the capital auction should be one of those forms. Another form should be absolute, perpetual private property, allowing for this regime of decentralization. But so there's no reason why the abstract idea of the market has to be translated into a unilateral single version of the market. That's the real subject of dispute. Now, yes.
Something that you argue is the Constitution ending up becoming now like full institutional paralysis. So I wanted to ask, what sort of role do you think the political parties, for instance, now serve in upholding that institutional paralysis when it comes to democracy in America?
Well, you're asking an empirical question about their attitudes to. Well, I think to a greater or lesser extent, they all share in the cult of the Constitution. And the cult of the Constitution, which is a specific form of institutional fetishism, it's like a golden calf. You bow down before this idol. This is anathema. It should be anathema to a Christian, to a Democrat, to everything. But one of its consequences, of which I think Americans are not aware, is that it biases constitutional revision in a particular direction. So in the United States, because the amendment process is so difficult, and because the Constitution is the object of a cult, of a religion, the Union and the Constitution forever, right?
Yeah.
That was the cry at the time of the Civil War. The way of changing the Constitution in the United States, uniquely in the United States, is not to change it, but to reinterpret it. Because you're stuck with the same Constitution, so the only way to change it is to reinterpret it.
Yes.
That has consequences, practical consequences, because it biases the change of the Constitution to changes in the interpretation of the general clauses defining rights and resources, like equal protection or due process. And it biases away from changes in the structure of the democratic government. So it's relatively easy to pretend that when the Constitution talks about equal protection, it means something different from what people previously thought it meant.
That's right.
And you open the American Law Reviews, and 90% of what's in them is this stuff, saying, no, it doesn't mean that, it means this. But if the Constitution, but it's much harder to pretend that when the Constitution says there should be 3 branches of government, it really means that there should be 5 branches of government. It's not, that's too incredible. So then the whole direction of constitutional revision is shifted towards this reinterpretation of rights and general clauses as a result of the strange cult of the Constitution. And I don't think people in the United States realize that. Huh?
We gave an example of the Equal Protection Clause defining railroads as people in the 19th century. And that's also occurred more recently in the 21st century.
Endless examples of that. You know? So that's the conception. And so and this relates to a reinterpretation of what it means for the state to be hard. So the class structure doesn't invade the democratic state. And instead of saying you do that by creating an authoritarian vanguard, which will take power, you do it by radicalizing democracy. In other words, the idea is the solution to all the problems of weak democracy is more democracy, not less democracy. Right? Now then, I want to claim that there are 4 or 5 sets of institutional innovations that would be crucial to the emergence of a high-energy democracy. And let's go through them relatively quickly. So first is innovations that increase the temperature of politics. By the temperature of politics, I mean the level of organized popular engagement in political life. And here, we did speak to this in an earlier class when we were speaking about the American Constitution early on in the course. And remember I said, the premise of conservative political science and conservative statecraft is that there is an inverse relation between political mobilization and political institutionalization. So this is what the conservative political scientists like Samuel Huntington said. There's this hydraulic relation between institutionalization and mobilization. And there is, at the end of the day, a choice between a politics that is cold and institutional and a politics that is hot but extra institutional or anti-institutional. Because if mobilization goes up, it eventually outreaches the institutions. And then it results in some form of Caesarism, populist Caesarism, which is extra-institutional. And I remember I said then, it's the belief that at the end of the day you have to choose between Madison and Mussolini. So that's the belief that's false. It's absolutely false that there is this choice between Madison and Mussolini. In fact, now, extending the discussion and relating it to present events, the Madisonian scheme, as we know in South America, facilitates the rise of the Mussolinis. And the scheme of a highly institutional but cold politics can easily be taken over by the caudillo, who, and it's relatively defenseless in the face of the caudillo, and the caudillo then turns it on its head and makes it something entirely different from what it was intended to be. So what's the objective? The objective is to increase the level of mobilization, but in a form that is institutionalized. Now, through what devices? Through a combination of practical devices, all of which are entirely familiar. They're part of the contemporary discussion around the world. And what are they? They're, for example, rules of mandatory voting. Many democracies in the world, rich and poor, are democracies that require everyone to vote. And what does that mean? It just means that you pay a little fine if you don't go to the voting booth. What's very interesting is that no democracy in the world that has adopted a rule of mandatory voting has ever later abrogated this rule. So, and the reason is that the rule of mandatory voting supports the collective habit of voting voluntarily, and then no one wants to go back on it. And that's very instructive. So in the American elections, half of the electorate votes, the other half doesn't vote. Politics in the United States would be fundamentally different if almost everyone voted. Now, a second example.
Fundamentally different.
The rules governing the relation between money and politics. No private money, or only tiny amounts. In the United States, the Supreme Court said, money talks. My colleague Paul Freund said, I thought that was the problem. So the public financing of political activity and the constraints on private money, the access to the means of mass communication, like saying, the media companies have to distribute free time to the political parties and the organized social movements as part of the condition for holding the revocable licenses under which they do their business. The time has to be distributed free. With respect to electoral regimes like proportional representation, first past the post, the relations are very circumstantial because in many societies, the institutional adopting proportional representation can have a mobilizing influence. In a society like Italy, where there's a multiplicity of political parties, it can be the opposite. Yeah. You can shake up the parties by adopting temporarily a first past the post rule and so forth. So there isn't one silver bullet, but the combined and convergent effect of these initiatives is to elevate the level of popular engagement in political life, undoubtedly. So people say it's a matter of political culture, that the Americans are depoliticized, that they're not interested in politics. You give me a rule of mandatory voting, you give me public finance of political activity, you give me free access to the television, and I'll show you how in the United States there will be a mobilization.
That's right. So how to implement that? How does...
That's exactly what it's more like that than the United States, yeah. It's more like we have public funding And we have other problems, yes. We have other problems, but not those problems, yes.
Okay, so I'm with you on these things because these are things that I had bills to promote, at least in the state of New York. And I think the thing that this is the impasse question that I mentioned before is very relevant in this conversation because I think there's an assumption with some of these obvious policies that should happen that there are people in power that might want them. But the people in power who might want them are in the minority. And the people who don't want them on both sides, especially in the Democratic Party, at least in the United States, that I've saw straight in New York, didn't want public financing of elections because their political parties would lose power. And their political parties are their little fiefdoms in places like the Bronx or Westchester.
Of course.
So the question that I have before that I feel like is very is I can apply it to this structure is that impasse is I was able to get around the impasse through having an insurgent campaign. It's so unusual.
But
it's
I
so
don't
unlikely.
think, well, first of all,
So the question is, how do you do it?
One of the ways in which you modify electoral rules governing elections, is you postpone their incidence to some time in the future, so they don't apply immediately. But the basic thing is, there can't be a change of the political regime unless there's a struggle over the social and economic direction. No one is going to change the form of politics just because it seems a good idea in the abstract. There has to be a struggle. For example, to say in the United States, we won't accept anymore this insular knowledge economy, this exclusive knowledge economy, which has this vanguard in the front and everyone else condemned to make work. Well, then we need another form of politics. So the other form of politics is not going to arise simply because in the abstract it seems good. And as if people were to say, and then we'll decide later what we'll do with it. That's not how it happens. That was the point I made before. Right. So it's when you're struggling against, you're struggling to have a national project in a different direction, and you can't have it under the present system. That's where the energy comes from. The energy has to be exogenous. It has to be a break into the political class through pressure applied from outside of it. It can't be a gift of the incumbent political class to the nation.
I agree with you, 100%, actually. But I'm still in my mind, and I'm like a pretty open-minded, like I would go for any crazy idea to get us out of almost anything that seems like a quandary that we can't get out of. But for some reason, my brain it breaks my brain to think about what that is, because we've seen like the inside-outside game is so relevant to politics. And I've played it, and it's great, it's successful. But there's a reticence for people to play it. Some people don't know how to play it, and I don't even know if it's necessarily relevant to what we're saying as a main point. But the point is that for some reason, there are people in this country who are in politics, who do have power, who are pushing, like you're saying, but it's still not breaking. So what did Brazil do
There isn't
that the
one
United
solution
States
to this.
didn't?
Who knows what could happen? I mean, Canada might become the next state of the American Union, or, and then there would be a permanent progressive majority in the United States, and that might be the solution. So who knows? Okay, so second set of institutional innovation. Second set of institutional innovation.
I mean, so one question just to go back to that could be like New York State. I mean, the state itself is very divided. Have state politicians.
New York City and upper state.
Yeah, and upper state. If they're dramatically different, would there be a possibility of enabling mandatory votes within the entire state? Or would people in New York City say, no, I'm not going to accept that, but cast it to the state as a whole? And there are a number of states that are in that position.
We tried.
Throughout the statewide, okay.
Didn't work.
Interesting.
Even with Democrats in full power of everything. Because our governor was not really a Democrat, but that's a
Okay, okay.
So now, second set of institutional innovations. Innovations that accelerate the tempo of politics, right? Because one thing is the temperature. The temperature is the level of engagement, of mobilization, and it's manifest in the facility for repeated structural reform. Then there's the tempo. The tempo is how fast it goes, how quickly it resolves impasse. And that relates to the thing I was saying a moment ago. So there are two principles in the American constitutional design. Let me give the example of the United States, because the course is about the United States, and it's easier. It's a tangible example. The American system of divided government. There are two principles in the constitutional design. There's a liberal principle of fragmentation of power. There are many sources of power in the state, like the Romans had. And then there's the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. That's the Madisonian scheme of checks and balances. The Americans think, I believe mistakenly, that these two principles are inseparable. And they're not inseparable. They're not naturally together. They're together by intention or by design. And what's the purpose of putting them together? The purpose of putting them together is to slow politics down.
Right.
That's what the purpose is. Because the belief is politics is dangerous. Right. Here we have this free order in the country. Right. It was better then because it was this economy of artisans. Right. So let's prevent it from being subject to these political storms. That's the slowing down. And what's the alternative? The alternative is to speed it up. Example, given in the American constitutional scheme. If there's an impasse between the two political branches, the president and the Congress, either branch should unilaterally have the prerogative to dissolve the impasse by calling early elections. But the early elections would always have to be bilateral for both branches, so that the branch that exercised the constitutional prerogative would have to pay the political price of running the electoral risk. And then you would transform the presidential regime into a device for the acceleration of politics. Now, there's an equivalent, an analogy in contemporary constitutions, which is the Constitution of the Fifth French Republic, which has two times. It has a fast time when the parliamentary majority coincides with the president, and it has a slow time, which the French call cohabitation, when the parliamentary majority diverges for the president. The system I'm describing, through the use of this mechanism, is like the French Fifth Republic, but it has only a fast time, has no slow time. Now, I imagine that contrary to what some of you may think, under this device that I described, the prerogative would be used too rarely rather than too often. It would be used too rarely because there would be a powerful inducement not to run the political risk. Why are the people who hold office going to subject themselves to the risk of being driven out of office? So that's more plausible. So I could say, well, it'll be faster, but it won't be as fast as I might want it. But many of you might say, well, it may be too fast, and we're afraid of that. But so that's the second print. Those are the second innovations. The objective in democratic politics should be analogous to what Karl Popper said is the objective in science: make mistakes as quickly as possible. Time is the supreme resource. Go fast. And that's the second set of arrangements. So high temperature, fast politics, and now comes the third principle, which is take advantage of the experimentalist potential of the federal system. To experiment. and to combine a facility for strong initiative by the central government with the power of different parts of the country to create alternative models of the national future. And I think typically this would go through 2 stages. In one stage, the emphasis is on cooperation. And there can be vertical cooperation in the federal system between the 3 levels of the federal, state, and municipal, and horizontal cooperation among the states, for example. And we know now already in the United States that cooperation is a powerful instrument of experimentalism. The governors, like the Western governors, have associations, and they're actively experimenting, Republicans as well as Democrats, with forms of industrial policy. Every governor in the United States wants to have this little Silicon Valley. So they start out with this Potemkin village. It's silly. It's a stupid idea that they're going to reproduce it by creating a little model of it like a Hollywood stage set. But it's a beginning
Yeah,
of other things that
It's a,
can be much better.
it's a
and
form
more
of
serious.
cooperation,
Yeah.
even though the subject of that form
Yeah.
of cooperation needs
So,
to
and
be
there are
defined.
things like industrial policy or educational policy that lend themselves very much to this combination of federal and local initiative. Depending on the way in which you combine divided powers with concurrent powers in the federation. And of course, you would ultimately have to reform the American Constitution to discipline the use of concurrent powers in the federal system. Now, I think there's a second stage in this experimentalist use of federalism, which is what I would call wide divergence. So in a federation, if one part of the country has a certain power of diverging, it has to be the same level of power as all states have. In other words, the level of divergence is universal. And if it's universal, it can't be very wide. For it to be very wide, it has to be unique. So what would be desirable then is for certain states, certain parts of the country, to be able to apply for a right of very wide divergence. They want to try out a different way of organizing the market. They've been convinced by the idea of the rotating capital auction. That's not going to happen. Not in Utah. But it could happen. There are other examples. And we know, and this has to be vetted, because we know from American history that states' rights have historically been an instrument of abuse, of persecution, of oppression. So we have to be vetted by twice. Politically, by the Congress, and judicially, by the judiciary, to assure that it wasn't abused. Now, I think it's very interesting because we think that the experimentalism is just for federations. But with respect to this thing that I'm calling wide divergence, unitary states like the United Kingdom or France enjoy an advantage over federations. Because there isn't in unitary states the presumption that all parts of the country must enjoy simultaneously the same right of divergence. So the government of the United Kingdom can make a different deal with Scotland than the deal it makes with Wales, for example, or the deal it makes with the Midland Authority in England. And so that's very interesting. But the general objective is this objective that you have in the country a concert, a combination of experiments. So you're not dogmatic. As the country goes down a certain path, it hedges its bets by allowing different parts of itself to give the example of an alternative path. And the example is much more powerful when it's not just an idea, a programmatic conception, but is instantiated in an actual course of action, because then you can examine the experience, you can interpret it. Now let me give a fourth example, a fourth set of institutions, which, now before I do that, let me make a comment. Just taking these three that I've done so far. What's the best place to begin? That's a question someone might ask.
Or what's the spark?
And I think, and so I just want to give a personal opinion about that in the United States. So the general belief of the American progressives seemed to be the best place to begin is in the first set of innovations, and particularly the rules about money and politics. That's where many of them would begin. I don't think that's the best place to begin. I think the best place to begin is the third set about federalist experimentalism, because it has very wide appeal in the country, and because it crosses the ideological and partisan divisions between right and left.
Right.
So in countries like the United States or Brazil, we can only have a national project of development if we translate it into regional projects for the different regions of the country. And so there's an enormous value in being able to organize constitutionally the coexistence of those different strategies. So then that's the fourth set of innovations. Is to do this undone work. It came up earlier in the conversation today. Changes that are structural but localized in some particular part of the structure or some particular part of the country. There is no branch of the three-branch government that is designed, equipped, and resourced to do that. So let me give you an example then, because this is actually something that in the United States already happens. So this happened in the 20th century in the form of the so-called structural injunctions, by which the federal judiciary intervened in school systems, in prison systems, in mental institutions, and reformed them. And so the idea is the traditional form of adjudication is focused on individual litigants or classes of litigants. And the object is to redress a transgression of individual rights by restoring the status quo ante. And there's no structural change. And now comes a new form of adjudication, sometimes called complex enforcement, in which there are groups of people or classes of people. There is imputed to the law some general idea, like an anti-subjugation ideal. And a particular practice in a particular kind of social organization is judged as offensive to that ideal imputed to the law. Then the judge comes and he says, it's not just a redress of a transgression of individual right. It's a structural failure, it's a structural breakdown in the system. So judge, need to assign the reformation of this institution to some specialist, a special master, an expert, who will assume temporarily the management of this institution and fix it. Now, why did the judges do this? Because you could say it wasn't appropriate for any of the three branches of government, because the legislature is not designed to deal with localized problems. That would be a bill of attainder. The executive is not appropriate to deal with some change in structure. The judges aren't supposed to do it. They have this traditional form of adjudication. But the judiciary, the federal judiciary in the United States, did it. And why did they do it? I think they did because they wanted to do it. And because they could get away with it for a while. So in a certain period in the late 20th century, the progressives felt that they couldn't get a progressive project from the people. But they could get it from the judges. So the purpose of judicial politics was to be a circumvention of popular politics. And one of its creations was the structural injunctions, by which they intervened in what were thought objectionable, oppressive social organizations to reform them. Now, they eventually ran out of power, right? So why did they deal with mental institutions? Why didn't they deal with the banks? Why didn't they go into Chase Manhattan or Citicorp instead of going into some poor mental institution? It's because they could, that's what they could get away with, these marginal institutions. But what would be desirable then is to create a separate branch of government, co-elected by the other branches or elected by the people, and then to design it and resource it in a way in which it was equipped to do this work of going into, and what would it be for? Going back to the question you asked before, it would be especially for dealing with the situation of disadvantaged or excluded groups in society who are not able to escape the situation of disadvantage or exclusion by the devices of collective action that are available to them. So it's some insular minority or some excluded group that is in a situation of exclusion or subjugation from which it is unable to escape. And the current democratic government in these class societies that exist in the world is unable to redress that. So we would fix it that way, by designing a power, a new branch of government, explicitly designed and resourced for that purpose. So the argument is that creating these institutions translates that objective, that the theoretical aim of creating a high-energy democracy into practical detail. And I've given
So
an example of 4 sets of institutions.
So what do you see as a segue into the practical change, the spark that would lead to this?
Well, I think there's the choice has to be made. So I think the most powerful ideal around the world and in the United States is an ideal of the enhancement of agency, right? The ability to act. Because no one wants to be just no one wants just a sinecure, co-option, and that's the ruination of progressive politics, is this entitlements culture. That it's just a distribution of coupons, so you can make a call on the state. The call on the state may be necessary, but if it enables something, if it enables some form of agency. So the idea is throughout, with respect to the whole system of rights, the system of rights has 2 sides. One side is to provide a haven of vital protected interests. And the other side is for there to be a storm of innovation, of creation. And the ruination of social democracy in the 20th century was it had a lot about the haven, but had nothing about the storm. And the other side of the haven is the storm. That's the way in which people are respected, in which they're lifted up, in which they're empowered to become agents. And that's the guiding principle. And with respect then to particular things that are going on in the world, like the substitution of the old model of industry by the insular knowledge economy. So we want to create a state that is capable of contributing to the construction of an inclusive knowledge economy, rather than an insular knowledge economy that will exclude the vast majority of firms and of workers and consign everyone else to make work, which is what exists. Yes.
So another question for you. In the United States right now, is there an example in a state or region that has implemented the kind of that has implemented aspects that are creating a high energy democracy?
No, I don't think you can say that there's a state which is the voice of the future.
Okay.
And now I want to make a comment about the world, not just about the United
right.
States. So in the world, in the whole world, there's an enormous amount of experimentation happening at the ground level. In a country like India, this enormous Brownian motion from below.
Right.
But
Excuse me.
it's not organized into transformative projects at the national level or even at the regional level. But it's the raw material with which we can work. And I think the same thing is true of the United States. So there's a huge amount of experimentalist energy, but it's